Greetings, YouTube. I have received a request from Dark Fate concerning swords. He's discussing real-world swords, but I thought I could also roll this into role-playing games. Kind of get a two for gun on here today. So, his questions here. He wanted to know about some swords that you might find in a role-playing game, the real-world versions thereof. And his first is the longsword. Well, I have some news for the entire gaming community. No such thing. No one's ever actually called a longsword when they were used in period. Longsword is a term that was made up as a counterpart to short sword. Longsword didn't exist. There were swords that had longer blades, but no one called them longswords. They called them all kinds of other things, but longsword itself is a category of sword that doesn't exist outside of role-playing games. And that's fine. You don't really have to worry about it. You understand what it means. It means a blade, approximately 3 feet long, approximately about 1.5 inches wide or so at the maybe a little bit wider at the base. A very simple construction. It's your bog standard longer bladed sword. Everybody knows what it means. No one is confused. Even though it doesn't have any bearing in the real world, that's all that matters. The short sword. Now, the short sword, to my mind, the quintessential short sword, is the gladius, which I have right here. And for me, the definition of a short sword is something with a blade that's running in the 12 to 24 inch length, maybe 15 to 24. Under 15 would be a long knife or a dagger or a knife, something of a variety like that. A scram sax, for example, would be a good example of a long knife. And one of the things that's always kind of bugged me, for example, in the D20 system and in all the versions that I can remember of D&D, is that these are always viewed as piercing weapons. And they have a great point, and that's how the Romans used them. This was, used in formations, and they were thrusting them between the gaps in their shield between themselves and the neck guy in the phalanx. And yes, I know it's not called a phalanx. Shield formation, whatever you want to call it, fine. You get the point. Guys with shields, little gaps, swords thrusting through them. But you can swing this. This particular one I have right now is designed as a machete, and machetes are meant to be swung. Now, there's a very old saying amongst sword masters, and that is, you thrust with the edge, you slash with the tip. What it means is, you do whatever it takes you to do to live through the combat. And if that means using your weaponing in an unconventional manner, that's what you do. It doesn't matter what you do to get out of that fight alive. Yes, there are techniques, and you will rely on them most of the time, but there are times when those techniques will fail you. And in those moments, it's whoever's the most clever gets to walk away. And because of this, I pretty much think all swords should have both a slashing and piercing component. Yes, even two-handed swords. And I think that we may want to apply a style so that you have trained with a weapon and you are good at piercing style. And because of that, you get a +1 to hit when you're using the sword in a piercing manner, and you get a -1 to hit when you're using it in a slashing manner. Now, in D&D terms, for example, there are reasons for that, because there are times you want to do different weapon types of damage. There are times when piercing makes sense. There are times when slashing makes sense. And if a sword is not traditionally designed for piercing, maybe you dump it down one die type, for example. So if you wanted to, a short sword is designed in the game to be piercing. It does a die 6. Say if you have to use it as a slashing weapon, you do have it do a die 4. That kind of a thing. And yes, there were two-handed swords designed as piercing weapons. They were known as an estoc. At least one design was known as the estoc. There was also a hunting sword that had a cross piece that actually stuck out of the blade for hunting boar and wolves and things like that. Both of those were designed specifically for piercing. They weren't common, but they did exist, and they were designed just for that purpose. In fact, the hunting weapon didn't even have a sharpened edge below its piercing crossbar. It was the shaft was round, so it was just designed as a piercing weapon. He mentions the great sword and the two-handed sword. Same thing. There is no difference between a great sword and a two-handed sword. It's just two different names to describe the same item. Now, amongst weapon experts, real ones, not me, apparently I'm the brigade's weapon expert, I appreciate the compliment, but I think it's maybe slightly misplaced. I do have the most reference book, so maybe that counts for something. But if you were to take a sword and lay it on a table in front of a dozen weapons experts, you would get 13 answers about what that sword is. You were never going to get them to agree about anything. So when we have to break things down into categories, and so that we can understand them, so we can slap on names so that we can have a conversation amongst people who aren't gamers, and if you're gamers, so we can slap statistics to those weapons, we have to do things that the weapon experts would not do. There would be an entire spectrum of discussion, and we really can't do that. We have to have quanta. Boom. That's the way it works. And in the real world, it's the way it works. People don't talk about a spectrum of pretty much anything until you start talking amongst experts. And as the conversation gets narrower, 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 then yes, you start talking about quanta of things. I mean, specifics. But the real world, folks, subcompact, compact, mid-sized car. That's how we talk about them. We don't usually talk about how many cc's they have or what their wheel well, measurements are and stuff like that. Those broad categories is what we think in and converse in, and that's what we do here with weapons. Now the bastard sword, the classic hand-and-a-half sword, that's going to have a blade about 3.5, almost 4 feet long. It's going to be have a longer pommel. Crossguard to all of these weapons is going to be vary greatly. Crossguard has almost no bearing whatsoever on combat. It's very stylistic, or the type of defense it's used for, or things like that. The crossguards are really open to interpretation. I mean, like this one, for example, has essentially none. And the bastard sword really is just what it says. It's trying to bridge the gap between a broadsword and a two-handed sword. It costs less to make. It's easier to carry. It takes, you can possibly use it in one hand if you're really strong and well trained, but it's really designed as a two-handed weapon, ideally. Then he gets to the broadsword itself. Now the broadsword, the classic example of the broadsword is the Norse sword. The sword that the Norse used when they went a Viking. And remember, folks, Viking is a verb. And that's what, do a Google search, man. You'll find lots of stuff on Norse swords, many of them having very cool designs. I have one reference book in my collection that discusses, and this is the bulk of the book. This is what the book discusses. 38 varieties of pommels just on Norse swords. And I just drove my sword into my bookcase. All right. Then he's talking about some specific things like blade shape, length, grip length, crossguard, pommel design, weight, balance points. These are going to vary a lot. You will be able to find a dozen different short swords that have different variances in all of these things. And it's going to be really hard to pin them down. And a lot's going to vary on time period, materials used, which culture is producing them, which smith is making them within that culture. These things are really expert categories. These are things you can really going to have to get into on a really detailed basis to understand. And frankly, I think in role-playing games, they are not going to matter much, really. If you do a Google search, or you can go to my DeviantArt page and do a look at some of the swords I've got up there, and you can find things that fit what you think they should be. You hand that image to your GM, or send them a link or something, and say, "Here, this is the sword I'd like to use. What do you think it is?" And then you can talk about it. Now, a lot of the one-handed swords, they're long swords. Short-bladed one-handed swords, they're short swords. Longer than a long sword, it's probably a bastard sword. Longer than that, it's a great sword, or a two-handed sword. Okay, and these are the broad categories that you're going to be using for swords. Now, there are specialty things like the khopesh, which had a curved blade used by the Egyptians, which was useful to get around shields. It could probably realistically even be used as a trip attack if you were really talented with it. Not to mention, cut the crap out of someone's hamstring. But when you start getting into those really narrow things, that's when I come in. That's when I'm going to start talking your ear off and bore the crap out of you about swords. And it isn't going to help your game any, and it isn't going to help you having a conversation about swords with someone that isn't obsessed about them or isn't a overly detailed gamer. So I hope I've answered some of your questions, Dark Fate. I hope I have not left you with too much confusion here. There's a lot of information about swords. I've got dozens of books on them. They're a topic of endless speculation about the people in the world who have never used them. One of the problems is a lot of the surviving swords you see in museums today were wall hangers. There are two-handed swords that are seen in museums today in pristine condition, and people look at them and go, well, they had 6-foot blades! They weighed 40 pounds! You know those 6-foot blade, 40-pound swords? They were parade pieces. They were carried in front of a parade or in front of a leader to show his might. And that's all they were ever used for. They were never used in combat. No two-handed sword in the history of the world weighed more than 6 pounds. Sorry. Derailing there for a moment. So, swords are fascinating. I can talk about them forever. But I hope I answered some of your RPG-related questions for swords and maybe done some good to the gamers at large. Sorry for the motorcycle outside. And again, if you have specific questions and if I have failed to answer them, speak to me in the comments or send me a PM and I may be able to help you or at least give you a reference book that may be able to give you more information. Have a good one.